The video's analysis commences by delving into the origins of the Nephilim, figures mentioned in Genesis 6 verse 4, described as mighty men of old, men of renown. Their birth is attributed to the unnatural union between the sons of God, often interpreted as fallen angels, or watchers, according to apocryphal traditions like the Book of Enoch, and the daughters of man. This event is cited as the climax of earthly corruption, precipitating the divine decision to cleanse the world with the Great Flood. This very context of an unnatural creation immediately poses the video's central question: did these hybrid beings perpetuate their line, and specifically, who were the wives of these giants? The issue is not merely one of marital relations, it touches upon the biological, theological, and metaphysical nature of the Nephilim. The video stresses that nearly all ancient records, from the canonical Old Testament to early non-canonical Jewish texts, focus exclusively on male giant figures, such as Og of Bashan, Goliath, and the Anakim. The conspicuous absence of a giantess in these narratives constitutes a curious historical void. Is this due to the inherent sterility of the hybrid creature, a mechanism of divine protection to prevent the spread of supernatural corruption, or simply a deliberate or unintentional omission by male scribes? This silence is the starting point for all subsequent theories explored in the video. The contextual analysis of Genesis 6 suggests the Nephilim were an unwelcome intervention into the created order, a species capable of perpetual chaos, making the question of a female giant's existence and reproductive capability more critical than a mere genealogical detail. It is an indicator of whether corruption could sustain and spread itself independently. If female giants existed and reproduced, it would severely challenge the meaning of the Great Flood as an act of total purification of the earth from supernatural defilement. The very essence of the Nephilim, their half-divine, half-human nature, suggests an incompatibility with the natural order of human procreation, leading the viewer to question the viability of female giants and their progeny within the established biblical cosmology. The focus on their renown often implies military might and physical dominance, roles traditionally assigned to men in ancient historiography, thereby possibly sidelining the female role, regardless of its significance. One of the most potent theories presented by the video to explain the absence of female giants is the hybrid and sterile nature of the Nephilim. This hypothesis is predicated on the idea that the Nephilim were the result of an unnatural cross between two realms, the spiritual, angelic, and the material, human. In ancient and mythological biology, hybrid creatures are often considered infertile, much like a mule, a cross between a horse and a donkey. This served a crucial theological purpose, to limit the spread of supernatural sin. If the Nephilim could not reproduce, the line of these giants would be cut off after the first generation. This helps reinforce the role of the Great Flood as a means to exterminate the remaining Nephilim individuals, eliminating the need to worry about a self-sustaining lineage. This line of reasoning also logically explains why the post-Diluvian giants, like the Anakim and Rephaim, reappear after the flood. According to the Book of Enoch and other traditions, this later appearance was not due to the original Nephilim reproducing, but rather due to the fallen angels, watchers, repeating their transgression, intermingling with the surviving women again. This created a second generation of giants, also presumed to be sterile or eventually eliminated through the military campaigns of the Israelites. Furthermore, if giants possessed extraordinarily long lifespans, as suggested by their semi-angelic nature, the need for procreation to ensure the continuation of the species would be nullified. They could persist for centuries without the need for a wife, in a biological sense, to maintain their line. The sterility hypothesis also resolves the practical biological difficulty. A giant male, 10 to 15 feet tall, would face immense challenges in marriage and childbirth with a woman of average height. If they were infertile, they would only need wives, in the sense of companions or slaves, not partners of similar stature for successful procreation. The theological imperative here trumps biological necessity. The divine plan ensures that the monstrous lineage, born of forbidden unions, is a dead end. This perspective frames the Giantesses as superfluous to the story's main arc of divine judgment and redemption, making their historical omission an intentional feature rather than a flaw. The second major hypothesis the video explores is a crucial socio-historical argument, that female giants, giantesses, did exist but were excluded from history due to the patriarchal bias of ancient record keepers. In ancient societies, especially within the context of biblical record-keeping, genealogies and heroic deeds were typically recorded through the male line. The purpose of historical and religious documents at the time was to establish authority, land claims, and lineage through fathers and male leaders. Therefore, the absence of female giants may not be evidence of their non-existence, but rather evidence of a systematic omission of women's roles in public records. If a male giant warrior was remembered for his conquests, his wife, no matter how giant or powerful she might have been, would be sidelined from the narrative to maintain focus on the male lineage. Moreover, ancient societies not only recorded with bias but also tended to view women as property or extensions of the male identity. The wife of a giant might simply be referred to as OG's wife, rather than as an independent figure with her own identity. The video subtly points out that many other global mythologies, such as female titans in Greek mythology or female Jotun, giants, in Norse mythology, include both male and female giants. This universality of the female giant figure in unrelated cultures provides strong circumstantial evidence that the concept of a giantess was not foreign to the ancient human imagination. Therefore, their omission in the biblical context might simply be an editorial choice, intended to focus on events with significant theological or military implications, such as the Israelites' battles against the male giant tribes. This analysis encourages the reader to look past the textual silence and consider the cultural dynamics that shaped the historical record. The bias is seen not just as neglecting minor characters but as fundamentally defining who and what constitutes a subject worthy of historical record, a definition that overwhelmingly favored the male warrior archetype over the female, even one of massive stature. A critical practical analysis raised by the video concerns the logistical and biological hurdles of intermarriage between giants and regular humans. If a male giant, towering 10 to 15 feet, married a woman of average height, perhaps 5 feet, the disparity in size would create significant challenges not only in coitus but also in reproduction. The size difference could lead to extremely dangerous or impossible pregnancies and births for the smaller mother, especially if the fetus carried the giant gene. This biological difficulty itself reinforces the hypothesis that for giants to successfully reproduce, they would have to possess wives of similarly colossal stature. This theory relies on basic biological logic. The most successful mating typically occurs between individuals of compatible size. The video uses this point to argue that if the male Nephilim intended to maintain a lineage, even if a sterile one, they likely sought out the largest women possible among the daughters of man, or, in more extreme speculative scenarios, bred secondary generations of giant women to serve as their wives. Seeking larger wives would mitigate the health risks associated with pregnancy and childbirth. Furthermore, the daily life of a giant in a world built for average-sized people would be profoundly challenging. A female giant would be necessary not just for procreation but for other communal and social needs. If the giants lived in isolated communities, as some scholars suggest, then it would be a social necessity for them to have their own community of women, including female giants. Therefore, the lack of record of them may simply be due to the biblical scribes not encountering or interacting with these isolated communities, or deciding that their existence was irrelevant to the central theological message of the narrative. This analysis compels us to view the story not just on a theological level but also on the practical level of survival and reproduction, where a purely pragmatic need for a partner of matching scale would logically arise, making the silence on female giants even more problematic for those who accept the literal existence of the massive Nephilim. The latter part of the video focuses on the reappearance of giants after the Great Flood and their role as an adversarial force destined for eradication. The Nephilim are mentioned again in the Book of Numbers, where the Israelite spies report seeing the Anakim, descendants of Anak, considered remnants of the Nephilim, in Canaan. This reappearance challenges the notion that the flood entirely purged the world of the giant lineage and has led to two main interpretations. The first, as discussed, is the idea of the fallen angels transgressing again. The second is a more symbolic interpretation, where the giants represent the tyrannical, overwhelming, and corrupt forces that the Israelites must overcome to establish the Promised Land. Regardless of their actual origin, the role of the giants in these narratives is consistently that of a symbol of inevitable defeat. The most famous stories, like the battle between David and Goliath, are not merely military victories but deep theological lessons. Goliath, a massive rephaim, represents material power, arrogance, and the brutality of the old world. David's victory, a small shepherd with profound faith, over Goliath symbolizes the triumph of human resilience, divine intervention, and the ultimate downfall of all forms of supernatural corruption and overreach. The giants, male or female, are placed within a mythological arc whose destiny is to fall. They are relics of a bygone era, a testament to the failure of the forbidden blend of the terrestrial and the divine. Even if female giants existed, their role in the larger narrative would be to serve the downfall of their lineage. The eradication of the giant generations, through the campaigns of Joshua, the Judges, and ultimately David, is conclusive evidence that the angelic transgression was undone and the divine order restored. They exist to be defeated, a theological necessity that brings the narrative of sin and redemption full circle, regardless of the gender of the individual giant encountered. The conclusion of the video synthesizes the points of analysis and concludes that the lack of records concerning female giants is not a coincidence, but a silence with profound implications for both history and theology. If female giants did not exist, per the sterility hypothesis, this silence confirms the infertile nature of the Nephilim, limiting the spread of supernatural sin and proving that the angelic transgression was a failure from the outset. This reinforces God's power and control over the human lineage. Conversely, if female giants did exist, per the patriarchal bias hypothesis, this silence serves as a powerful reminder of the subjectivity of historical and religious records. It cautions the modern reader to analyze ancient textual sources critically, recognizing that the stories were filtered through a specific cultural lens, focused on maleness and conquest. This omission forces us to search for the women in apocryphal texts, parallel mythologies, and through other forms of circumstantial evidence. Either way, the core of the giant narrative remains one of failure and the end of an era. The Nephilim, male or female, are the vanquished. They represent the chaos and the overreach that was defeated by the divine order and executed by the resilience and faith of human heroes. Ultimately, the video concludes with a timeless lesson. Even the forces described as mighty men of old could not stand against the sweep of time and the will of the Creator. The mystery of the giants' wives is not answered by a name or a genealogy, but by the understanding that their story is part of the larger story of the restoration of order and the triumph of the human spirit.